Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Friends Public Virtual Meeting, Enhancing Diversity in Clinical Trials, Implementation of Diversity Plans. The topic of today's webinar has rightfully received an increasing amount of attention over the past several years. Today, we will be focused specifically on the development of enrollment goals and strategies to operationalize diversity action plans as set forth in the Food and Drug Omnibus Report Act, or FDORA. We're very pleased to have a lead author of this important legislation, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, joining us today. Friends has partnered with Representative Eshoo for over a decade on a wide range of issues to improve healthcare. This most recently includes her efforts to introduce the Pediatric Cancer Drug Supply Act to address the ongoing challenges with drug shortages. There is not a more formidable champion and committed advocate for patients. Representative Eshoo will be followed by a key leader at the FDA who herself has managed an extensive portfolio of critical projects during her time as the chief scientist at the FDA and now as the principal deputy commissioner, Dr. Namandjé Bumpus. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Representative Eshoo to start today's conversations. Congresswoman?
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Jeff Allen, President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research, for inviting me to be with you today and for his generous words of introduction. I'm so grateful to Friends of Cancer Research for bringing together leaders in clinical trials to improve how medicine is studied in all patients. And it's an honor for me to be with you today to discuss how Congress is ensuring medicines work for all Americans. FDA data shows that for drugs approved in 2022, white patients comprised a majority of patients enrolled in clinical trials. Fixing this inequity is not only fair and just, it's good science. Diverse clinical trials ensure all Americans can be confident treatments being developed will work for them, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, or their age. As the first woman in the history of Congress to chair the Health Subcommittee in the House, I'm immensely proud to have passed legislation titled the DEPICT Act to improve clinical trials. It became law as part of the 2023 Omnibus package and requires companies to report to the FDA how they will include a representative patient group in their clinical trials. This is the first time in our country's history there's been a standard for diversity in clinical trials in law. FDA previously sought to improve clinical trial diversity, but it was through voluntary guidance. The legislation also requires FDA to issue guidance to promote clinical trials using digital health technology and telehealth to allow for a meaningful, diverse clinical population. These decentralized trials were a huge improvement during COVID, and they need to continue. When the DEPICT Act was signed into law, the FDA was given 1 year to issue or revise guidance for how and when drug and device companies must submit diversity action plans for clinical trial research. They're currently several weeks past the December 29th, 2023 deadline that Congress gave it to complete its important work, and you can be sure I'll stay on this. In the past 12 months, experts reviewed diversity plans submitted to FDA Center for Drug and Evaluation and Research by manufacturers of drugs for treating cancer, and only 2 were found to be acceptable. So I will hold the FDA certainly accountable to ensure it holds up its end of the law, because patients and their families should not have to wait any longer to be part of life-changing clinical trials. I'm unendingly grateful for our long-standing work together on clinical trials, addressing pediatric cancer, and so many other important issues. So I thank you for inviting me to be with you today virtually, and thank you to the entire Friends of Cancer Research team for your superb work on this and other issues. I'm now pleased to acknowledge Dr. Namandjé Bumpus, and who is the FDA's former chief scientist and now FDA's principal deputy commissioner. Thank you, everyone.
Clinical trials provide evidence for the safety and effectiveness of medical products. Enrollment of clinical trial populations that reflect the diversity of the patient populations that will use the medical product, if approved, helps to build confidence in the generalizability of study results. FDA has a long-standing commitment to clinical trial diversity, as evidenced by the issuance of guidance and policy development in this space, along with other initiatives related to health equity. For example, the eligibility criteria guidance provides recommendations for increasing diversity by broadening eligibility criteria based on what we know about the disease and the drug product. FDA centers and offices have ongoing public education and outreach to promote health equity, including diversity in clinical trials. So one example I'd like to share with you is in our Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, where they have an initiative that's aimed at identifying barriers to clinical trial enrollment for underrepresented populations and employing innovative strategies, trainings, education, and communication methods to increase clinical trial enrollment for underrepresented populations. And here, when I refer to underrepresented populations, that includes, but is not limited to, ethnicity, race, age, disability, and geography. Now, in addition to the many ongoing FDA initiatives to promote clinical trial diversity, there's a great deal of effort across the agency related to execution of the requirements under the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act of 2022, or FDORA. Notably, FDORA requires diversity action plans for clinical investigations in support of medical product marketing applications. These plans provide enrollment goals that may be based on what is known about the disease or condition, what is known about the US prevalence of the disease or condition, or the patient population itself. Considerations should include demographic factors such as age, sex, race, and ethnicity, non-demographic factors such as comorbidities affecting the patient population, and potential barriers to enrollment such as geographic disparities in access to care or socioeconomic status. Early and ongoing discussions with the appropriate FDA review divisions during drug development are critical to successful diversity action plans. So I'd also like to take a moment and talk about some general considerations for enrolling diverse participants. So to enroll diverse participants in a clinical trial, it will be important to engage underrepresented communities in a meaningful way and a sustained way that allows for gaining insight into the research questions and barriers to participation that are most relevant to their experiences. So in doing so, the research community should seek opportunities for greater engagement and to broaden participation by working to reduce barriers to clinical trial participation, including through careful consideration of eligibility criteria and bringing trials to the community when feasible and appropriate. So for example, digital health technologies can be incorporated that allow for remote data collection and assessment. Can also leverage incorporation of decentralized trial participation elements, such as conducting study visits via telehealth or in-home visits where possible. Engaging a wider range of providers and medical facilities to contribute to trial conduct can also facilitate access. These approaches may enhance convenience for trial participants, reduce the burden on caregivers, and facilitate research for populations with limited mobility or access to traditional trial sites. Also key to addressing these issues is continuing to build an inclusive scientific workforce. So I'll close by saying that this is a time of unique opportunity to advance clinical trial diversity, and that there are a range of strategies and tools available for deployment. Implementation of the appropriate complement of tools holds great promise for broadening access to trial participation, enhancing meaningful representation of clinical trial populations, and supporting equitable adoption of innovative therapies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bumpus and Representative Eshoo, for opening the meeting today and for your continued leadership. Our first panel discussion today will largely focus on the discussion document that you should have received in advance of today's meeting. As you can see, this was developed with the input provided by a number of organizations, and we very much thank them for their contributions. I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Riha Vaidya from the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center for Session 1, Data-Driven Approaches for Establishing Diversity Enrollment Targets. Thank you. Riha?
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everyone to our first session for today. I am Riha Vaidya. I'm a senior research scientist in the Public Health Sciences Division at Fred Hutch Cancer Center. I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We have Scully Belgrave, who's Senior Director and Head of Patient Inclusion at Parexel, Henry Bennett, Global Clinical Operations Development Unit Head for Oncology and Hematology at Novartis, Lola Fashoyin-Ajay, Director of the Office of Clinical Evaluation of Cell and Gene Therapies at the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and Michelle Noon, Mathematical Statistician at the Data Analytics Branch of the National Cancer Institute, and Cleo A. Riles, Head of Health Equity Research at Flatiron Health. Welcome, everyone. So the goals of our session today are to discuss the types of data we have available for setting diversity enrollment targets in oncology trials. We'll talk a little bit about strategies for using different data sources, the potential obstacles and how to overcome them. And finally, we'll close with discussing future needs and opportunities to enhance available data so we can support more diverse and equitable trials. To start off our session, I would like to invite Lola Fashoyin-Ajay to give us an overview of FDA activities related to diversity plans. Take it away, Lola.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to Friends of Cancer Research for convening this webinar, and to Congresswoman Eshoo and Dr. Bumpus for their introductory remark, which I think really set the stage for this discussion. I think the why has been described in Congresswoman Eshoo's remarks and Dr. Bumpus's remarks. So I will just focus on the fact that for many years, this issue around clinical trial diversity has not been prioritized in drug development, at least not with the consistency and prospective consideration or at the scale that is needed to improve upon the disparate participation rates that we see for certain populations in clinical trials that we review at the FDA. So the agency, as you heard, has for many years issued guidances providing recommendations that are intended to accomplish this goal. And these guidances have focused on recommendations that promote broad clinical trial enrollment practices, like addressing eligibility criteria, focusing on particular logistic and operational issues that may impact certain populations from participating in clinical trials. And most recently on developing a prospective strategy early in clinical development to enroll historically underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities in clinical trials. So while this most recent guidance focuses on racial and ethnic minorities, I want to emphasize that FDA takes a broad view and broad consideration for what diversity means. And while we focus on demographic groups, there are many clinical factors that track along certain demographic groups. And so we certainly also consider that. So in 2020, we issued a draft guidance on diversity plans, and this was really an attempt to provide a framework for developing a prospective plan that includes explicit goals for enrolling a diverse population in clinical trials for drugs, biological products, and devices. And this guidance really was expanding on our previous guidances that were generally focused on diversity. And what the feedback we received was that it was an unclear understanding of what exactly FDA wanted to see. And so the guidance really provides recommendations on an approach to developing and submitting diversity plans to the FDA, and describes sort of the overall sponsor strategy to enroll a diverse population that for trials that are conducted with the intent to support marketing applications in the future. So I won't spend too much time describing the guidance in detail, but it really focuses on really taking a very thoughtful look at the population for whom the medical product is being developed, and then identifying their distribution across the racial and ethnic subsets of the population affected with the disease, and then specifying enrollment goals on the basis of that, and then describing what measures will be implemented or undertaken to meet these enrollment goals. And, while that guidance does focus on racial and ethnic minorities, it encourages sponsors to consider other demographic groups defined by age, sex, gender, and so forth, and geographic representation as well. And so in oncology, as you heard Congresswoman Eshoo mention, we have received the majority of these diversity plans in the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA. And we have reviewed these, and we have really gotten an experience from the sponsor side, I think, as well as the FDA, in really identifying areas that still need some clarification and or discussion, as we'll be doing today. And so as Congresswoman Eshoo mentioned before, as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, or FDORA, was enacted, and it provides these provisions for clinical trial diversity and modernization, including, giving FDA the authority to require the submission of diversity action plans as a measure to increase enrollment of participants from historically underrepresented populations in the clinical trials. And so these sponsors, as provided for in this legislation, are required to submit diversity action plans for phase 3 or other pivotal trials applicable to drugs, biological products, or devices. And FDORA also requires FDA to issue new guidance or update existing guidance describing this requirement, specifying the content and format of diversity plans and the procedures related to their submission, modifications, and updates. As part of the legislation, FDA is also required to convene one or more public workshops to solicit input on increasing enrollment of historically underrepresented populations in clinical trials, and we held one such workshop in November of 2023. And there's also reporting requirements for FDA for these diversity action plans annually to Congress. So I will say that, as I mentioned before, the draft guidance on diversity action plans, as Congresswoman issued, has not yet been issued as of it was due to be issued in December of last year, but we're working very hard to get that out to our stakeholders. I will say that the experience that we've acquired to date and the comments that we received on the draft guidance on diversity plans has really been helpful in helping us to think through areas where we may need to provide more information about our thinking, or areas where we may borrow from to facilitate implementation in the context of FDA trials. The workshop in November 2023 was also very helpful. The topics that we discussed and the perspectives that were shared in that meeting were very broad and gave us all food for thought to take back to our respective organizations to think about how to incorporate recommendations that were shared to address limitations in our current approach and so many other issues. So the OCE, the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence, where I was formerly leading Project Equity, also has an ongoing initiative in collaboration with the American Cancer Society, where we're really discussing potential strategies to identify sources of data that can be used for benchmark setting for diversity goals in oncology clinical trials, including for rare cancers or subsets of common cancers, where it can really be very challenging in determining how to set or what data to use or what information to use for benchmark setting. And so we will be discussing how enrollment for global trials can meet the requirements specified in FDORA. And all in all, we're really very happy for the ongoing discussions on this topic at every level with many different stakeholders, and really look forward to continuing to find solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. So clearly there are a lot of different components and aspects to developing a diversity plan for clinical trials. But what we like to focus on for the rest of the session is a bit of a deeper dive into how enrollment goals are set and some of the data sources available. So as Lola mentioned, a key step in starting to think of diversity plans is really understanding the target populations for any given clinical study. So Annie and Cleo, I'd like to begin by asking you to comment on some of the primary data types that are currently used to establish these diversity enrollment goals, and what are some of the main challenges in accessing and interpreting these data?
Sure, thank you. I can start. So I'm at the National Cancer Institute in the SEER program. And so we have population-based cancer registry data on about half of the US population. And so I think this is a really great resource to get the distribution of people eligible for the trial. Of course, that depends on really what the inclusion criteria are. So in the SEER program, we are constantly trying to enhance our data with current tumor markers. We have, I think, good data on histology, and really trying to do linkages for other data sources to really enhance that. I think a challenge is that we really don't have, say, individual data on social determinants of health. So we do have that some information on the census tract level, such as percent poverty or rural, urban, but unfortunately that's not individual level data. I think there is some opportunity. We do have the SEER data linked with Medicare claims. That of course would be in the 65 plus population, so older cancer patients. But there may be some opportunity there to look at distribution of, say, comorbid conditions and get some of that data on the cancer patients. Yeah, thank you.
Cleo?
Thanks so much. So in addition to the data sources that Annie described, there are also real-world data sources like claims data and EHR-derived data, as well as genomic databases and repositories like the Cancer Genome Atlas. Now, in terms of real-world data sources, particularly EHR-derived real-world data, like the data we curate and generate evidence from at my company, Flatiron Health, some of the strengths include the depth and breadth of clinical detail on patients, including information on cancer recurrence, lines of therapy, and tumor biomarkers, as well as the recency or near real-time availability of these data sources. Now, I think some of the main challenges with respect to these data are that there's some degree of missingness along key measures or variables of interest like race, ethnicity. There's also overrepresentation of insured patient populations. And then again, as Annie alluded to, lack of detail on social determinants of health. Now, that being said, there are analytic approaches that are available to address these sorts of challenges, including imputation methods, AI and machine learning approaches. And in our case at Flatiron, we've gone to great lengths to integrate social determinant of health details into our data and evidence offerings. Now, with respect to genomic databases and repositories like the TCGA, these are really some of the most detailed and readily available sources of biomarker data. But again, some of the challenges here include inconsistencies in race ethnicity categorizations, as well as overrepresentation of white patients and patients receiving care at large academic medical centers, when we know that the majority of patients with cancer are actually receiving care in the community. But I just want to stop for a moment here and just highlight that in terms of setting diversity enrollment goals, I really think that there's tremendous opportunity and value in linking high quality clinical data from the EHR with robust genomic data, especially given the increased focus on biomarker-driven drug development and what we're beginning to learn with regards to racial ethnic differences in tumor molecular profiles and biomarker status across a variety of tumor types.
Thanks, Cleo. And Henry and Scully, I would like to ask you next. So these data sources we've heard of from Annie and Cleo, how do sponsors use some of these to inform enrollment targets for diversity plans, and kind of what are some of the gaps you encounter in this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rhea. So I'm Henry. I'm from Novartis, and I think the first thing to talk about with this very important topic is how do we actually structure ourselves to make sure that we can set ourselves up for success. So we really take the diversity action plans very seriously. We have senior leadership involved from both our development operations and our development organization to really make sure that we have the right infrastructure in place to have a focused organization. This is so important. Then we think about what are we trying to generate evidence through, and that would be from early on in making sure that we have for our very early assets, even as we just bring them into the clinic, through to our registration trials, as we need to bring our diversity action plans to the FDA for agreement, all the way through to our post-marketing evidence generation process. Then we make sure that we've got all of our processes, procedures in place. And what's super key is that we have real targets. And I want to talk a little bit about the targets and some of the challenges we have with the targets and maybe some successes. But we track the targets. Once we've established them, we track them, and then we have a monitoring system to ensure that we're really working towards them. And most importantly, we then have to have I represent operations at Novartis Oncology. So we have to have operational plans and the true tactics. And I think that will be coming up in a later session about what are some of the special nuances that we can think about, like making sure we reach out to community-based practices and we have decentralized clinical trials and other innovations that we can bring forward. I think with some of the challenges that my panelists have already raised, I think with these large EMR databases are fantastic. One example is we use Trinetics, which is one of many EMR databases, and it has approximately 150 million patients across 79 large US healthcare organizations, which is really a large number of data coming out of this data set. But is it under reporting disease incidence for those patients that are not getting medical care? Are we getting all of the patients captured in there? We also have the topic of lack of granularity. As we know, cancer is not one disease. There are many subtypes in cancer. And are we making sure that we're getting these subtype granularity classifications coming through in the data so that we can really drill down to have very targeted goals? The SEER data was already mentioned by the panelists before me, which is a very important data source. And obviously we have other methodologies like surveys, physician surveys reaching out to patients, but they will naturally be relatively small sample sizes. We have literature searches for those cancers where we have good literature that can be a very good source to establish what should be the right targets that we should be looking for these diverse and underrepresented populations. Yet there are examples in rare diseases where the literature really is sparse. And so I think in the totality of this is that we triangulate all of these data sources and we come up with the most plausible and realistic goals and metrics that we can, and obviously put these through into our diversity action plans, and then we execute this with our operational plans throughout the life cycle. And it's the tracking of this, the constant adjusting if we're not reaching them. And we do have some successes for some of our cancers here. I think there's a lot that we're proud of, but also we're humble and we realize that we're on the journey here and we're going to be bringing this through across the whole portfolio. Thank you.
Well, Riha, I think that Henry has positioned this really well from the perspective of sponsors. I would agree that it's so important to establish a multidisciplinary team. So I work at ParExcel. We're a clinical research organization, and we develop FDA plans for both pharma and biotech. And you can imagine that for each indication and for each sponsor, there will be slightly different needs. And so it's really important that that multidisciplinary team can use the epidemiology literature searches. And as has already been said, there are challenges with that at times when you think about the fact that typically in academia, we research the things that are of interest to us. And if 30 years ago, certain things were not of interest, the data about those things is not going to be there's not going to be as much of a volume of that. So that's one thing we have to think about. So what we do is in terms of kind of triangulating, as Henry has said, the epi literature searches with the real world data from sources like Trinetics and Purple Labs and others. We then have to think about where else, and that's where patient voice comes in. So patient insights become important. So those patients who aren't in the literature and aren't in the real world data, hopefully we can capture their voices through patient insights and interviews. And that's an important thing I would add. And then the other piece, the all important piece, is that in terms of challenges, is that we, Congress and the FDA have kind of made this really important, bold move, and sponsors, and I include us, when we represent sponsors as CROs, say, hey, sites go off and do this. And the sites are left to do a lot of that work. So in my mind, one of the ways that we can help with implementing these plans is at the site level, ensuring that we give sites as much intel as we can in terms of how and where the patients are. And then in turn, sites educating patients so that they in turn will give their racial and other demographic data so that it can all kind of roll up into this well executed plan, from that triangulation. So the patient voice, the site voice, I would add those to that multidisciplinary team within our organizations.
Thanks, Coley. And Lola, could you comment on kind of what the FDA's expectations are for how these different data sources are being used? And, some of the issues surrounding the level of detail that's expected when we think of, say, granularity of categories for race and ethnicity, specifically when we're talking about small populations or rare diseases?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've been able to receive quite a few of these diversity plans. And on the topic of race and ethnicity, I think my general comment will be that I think overall sponsors are using categories that are defined for reporting race and ethnicity as consistent with our guidance. And that guidance really is based upon the Office of Management and Budget Directive 15, which provides, categories for reporting race and ethnicity. Those recommendations are obviously under review, and FDA guidances will be updated once we have, final decision on how granular we could be. But we did just issue a new guidance, which again reaffirms the importance of providing as granular data as can be provided in clinical trials and clinical studies. We do recognize from our multiple forays into the use of real-world data and data from electronic medical records that information can be collected quite inconsistently. And so our recommendation would be to follow FDA guidance on that particular topic.
Thank you, Lola. And I think all of you have in some ways touched upon kind of the limitations of current data sources. Like specifically, we talked a little bit about data missingness. So Annie, from your perspective and your experience as an epidemiologist, what do you think are, some of the approaches we can use to help with these challenges with data quality?
Sure. I mean, I can first say what we're doing at the SEER program. So as I mentioned, we are trying to do linkages to enhance the data, linkages even to get, say, for example, with pharmacy data to augment treatment that may be useful in this context of what previous treatment patients have had. As I mentioned, the tumor markers and other genetic data. SEER also is doing work to get better granularity on the race ethnicity data. So for example, there is work being done to separate out, for example, Asian and Pacific Islander race ethnicity groups. There's also some work, unfortunately, with the American Indian, Alaska Native data. So far, our data is really just limited to the PRICTA areas, which are those areas serviced by the IHS. And so unfortunately, I think there's a lot of misclassification that happens there. And so I think just working to try to improve the quality of that data as well. And so we have lots of projects and initiatives happening to try to just improve the quality of the race and ethnicity data that we have. It is a challenge for us since we do mostly want to report incidence rates. And so one challenge that comes up is that even if we have the case data, we may not have the matching population. But I think actually for this purpose, it is possible to just, for example, get the distribution of cases, which may be useful in this context for the enrollment targets. And I think, yeah, as Cleo mentioned, to really use all of the tools that we have, missing data techniques, linkages with other data sources, just to bring it all in to really try to improve the quality of the data. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yes, and I can definitely attest to how great a resource the SEER data has been for us in our cooperative group setting, where we kind of look at our own the diversity of our own patient population in our trials and benchmark it against kind of SEER to see how representative our populations are. And really just thinking of our findings from some of these NCI-sponsored trials, I wanted to ask both Scully and Henry to comment on whether some of these findings that have come out from cooperative group work on diversity and representation sort of inform your sponsors' efforts on setting diversity targets for oncology trials, and really just other successful data-driven approaches that you have used for executing plans.
Henry, do you want to go first, or?
Sorry, please go ahead. You go first. I was first last.
That's okay. Thank you. I was thinking, yes, all of that additional information is always useful. And I know that there's another panel that's going to talk about a little bit about execution, but I think part of the value when it comes to kind of being able to deliver on these trials is, yes, keeping up to date with the patterns and the trends that come, you know, from you know, the latest research and the latest sources, building that into that plan that we already talked about, and then at a project level, monitoring that data in a way to ensure that in your delivery you are reflecting what you planned for. And that, so I would say, you know, the additional thing for me is making sure that you bring together these, you know, the theoretical then with the practical, and again, as well as kind of having, you know, kind of voices from thought leaders, keep going back to the sites and finding out, you know, if we're not on track, why not, and speaking and finding out from the patients as well, just to kind of, again, triangulate that kind of thought leadership with the real world.
Thank you. I think it's very well said. I don't have a lot more to add on this particular one. We are very focused on making sure that we look at how can we balance bringing the medicines to market as quickly as possible so that patients can benefit from these, you know, life-changing medicines. So we run global trials, and we want to balance this acceleration of global trials with making sure that we have an adequate footprint in the USA. We very much have a focused position on delivering clinical trials in the USA, and then how can we get that right representation within the USA, within the diversity action plan. So we have to look at this as trade-offs, and what do we need to do. And there can definitely be examples where we can both have our cake and eat it too, meaning we can go to those sites that have got proven ability to recruit patients from diverse populations. We have this data. If we analyze this data, and when we do our feasibility, we reach out to these investigators and these other community sites, and they can both deliver at the speed that we need to deliver so that we can be competitive on a global point of view, but we can also bring comprehensive list of tactics, operational strategies to make sure that we're really having a focused approach to this. And I think that is one of the key things for us when we think about the, you know, the global drug development industry and how important it is that we still stay focused.
Thanks, Henry. And to follow up on what you said, so what are some of the implications for global drug development strategies when you're kind of, you know, balancing with these US-focused targets for diversity enrollment? Because globally, we know that often race, ethnicity, for example, tend to be defined very differently in different countries, and there are different rules for collecting data.
Exactly, Ria. So, for example, we set our targets to reach our diversity, equity, inclusion based on FDA guidance to reach, you know, for example, looking at Black or African American representation for some of our trials and cancer trials. But then the question then becomes, can we supplement this with patients that come from, for example, South Africa for the Black population? That would be a question to the FDA if that would be acceptable. When we're looking at Latino populations, could we bringing in populations from Argentina or Latin America, and is that also? So I think these are some of the things that we also need to find more clarity as we build in our plans, because as I said before, it is important to us that we can balance the needs for a global development of our drugs, and we have highly competitive space here. So we in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, we have a lot of interest for some of the cutting edge technology that we work on, and then balancing that to make sure that we stay focused on our US commitment to the FDA and our commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Henry. So next, Cleo, I would like to move to you and ask you about EHR data that you mentioned is used at Flatiron Health, and how can that be used to support data-driven approaches to identify patient selection or site selection for trials?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So at Flatiron, our clinical research team has spent a significant amount of time thinking about how to best leverage real-world data from the EHR to enable more efficient and representative clinical trials. So this includes tech-enabled, data-driven approaches to support patient identification and site selection as well. So to give you a couple of concrete examples, so our team has been able to, for example, develop digital tools that leverage real-time EHR data to help trial sites identify potential trial-eligible patients at the point of care. Additionally, in one of our products, what we've done is we've integrated automated prompts that notify clinical study teams of all patients meeting eligibility criteria at a site. And this is really important or critically important to help curb the potential impact of implicit bias in patient identification and trial offering. Again, this is one of those key barriers as well to trial participation. Another thing that we're doing, we're also leveraging real-world data from the EHR to support the selection of more inclusive trial eligibility criteria. A couple of my fellow panelists have already spoken to this a bit. And we actually presented research on this at the ASCO annual meeting last year. But in doing so, what we're able to do is simulate for trial sponsors how modifying trial eligibility criteria can result in a more diverse cohort of eligible patients and ultimately more representative enrollment goals. And then moving on to site selection. So what we've also found is that practice level EHR data, it can also be used to help trial sponsors efficiently identify practice sites based in more diverse communities, and also those sites that have more diverse patients overall. And then the last thing that I want to point out, and I'd really be remiss if I didn't bring this up, is the important role of AI and machine learning in this context. Over the past few years, we've seen several innovations in the real world data and clinical research space that have really been enabled via AI and ML, including large scale abstraction of clinical details from the EHR. So really digging into the unstructured data in that case. And then it's also been used to help support patient matching to clinical trials. And then now with the advent of large language models, it's likely that AI is going to continue to play an increasing role in this space. But I do want to highlight that being said, it's also critical that the development and implementation of these models includes rigorous efforts to actually assess and mitigate potential algorithmic bias so as to prevent the perpetuation and potential exacerbation of already existing inequities in trial participation. So those are just a few examples that I think are really relevant to point out.
Yeah, that sounds really great. And I think it'll be more and more important to be sort of aware of and, keep refining these as we move beyond our focus on race and ethnicity and move on to other aspects of diversity, like looking at gender and sex or age or, even social determinants of health. So Lola, I would like to ask you about sort of what the FDA is thinking about implementing diversity plans that extend beyond race and ethnicity.
Well, I think that's kind of a tricky question, as we typically describe what our expectations are in guidance, and the guidance that would address, the federal legislation is still pending. But I think that, as laid forth in the legislation, the expectation is that enrollment goals will be specified, disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sex, and age group that reflect, sort of the prevalence of the disease or the condition. But beyond that, I'm not sure I can really get into what those expectations would be, but we've been working very hard to get that out to the public. But I think that the legislation is very much in alignment with our initial draft guidance, and so I'm not sure that we would expect a different approach there with respect to that. I would say that, we do also view diversity very broadly. And I want to just make a comment about sort of, moving on from this or that. We want to avoid sort of kind of pitting one group against the other groups. The idea really here is that we take a very comprehensive approach to ensuring that the population that we end up with in the clinical trial reflects the population for whom the medical product is intended. And in some cases, it'll be very easy to do that. And in other cases, such as in rare diseases, it might be very difficult to do that because you have challenges with respect to small patient sizes, poorly understood even epidemiology of the disease in some cases, restrictions of where the data that even supports our understanding of the disease is coming from. So the idea here is to really apply a framework that looks at whatever available data we have, the best available data we have, to try to set benchmarks and to try to address the operational logistical barriers that we can to ensure that the trial enrolls a population that can provide evidence that informs a safe and effective use of the drug for all patients.
Thanks, Lola. And Scully, I'd like to ask you if there are any strategies you think of for the future that can enhance the capture and definition of some of these data sources, again, not just limited to race and ethnicity, but all of the other aspects, each of which affect different trials differently in terms of diversity plans.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what's been said so far in terms of kind of using a combination of kind of technology and human grit. What I would say is one of the areas that we should perhaps invest a little more in is that little space between the front door and the patient, the front door and the doctor, and that's the patient. Because we can have all the AI that tells us where the patients are, and we can put, Henry and I can have our teams build all the plans in the world, based on that data, from Annie and from all the other kind of data sources. But unless those patients understand why we want to know their race or ethnicity, and in my case, sometimes age, it's going to be really difficult for us to be able to show up to Lola's organization and say, hey, look, here's that data for that trial. There will keep being gaps until patients understand why we're asking that data. So I think the work for me is, first of all, with the sites, helping them to understand why it's important to the bigger picture. And when I speak to patients, they say, and even site staff says, if we knew that the data, if we knew that missing race and ethnicity data might delay the drug going to market, we would have given the data. So this isn't a technical solution. For me, this is a people solution that builds on the technical solutions that we've already discussed.
Clearly. And in the last few minutes we have for this session, I would like to ask each one of you to just give a really quick brief, an elevator pitch, if you will, on what you would like to see as a key action item or priority to continue progress in this area. We'll start with you, Annie.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, well, as I've said, I think we at SEER are just constantly trying to improve our data, improve the quality, enhance the data items. I think too, just very briefly, I think we do have electronic pathology reports that come in. And so there's some work on sort of more, we'd call it rapid case ascertainment. And so maybe some opportunity that as patients become eligible, the physician could get that data and then talk to the patient about perhaps enrolling on a trial. And that could be just another way or another process to sort of get to patients who may be eligible for trials.
Cleo?
Yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, I think, here we've discussed a variety of data sources, each has its own strengths and limitations. So I really think it's going to be important for all of us to honestly come together. I know we all have our own sets of interests and priorities, and even competition is at play here, but it's really going to be important for all of us to come together, to work together to develop a solution, develop a framework with methodological guidance on how to leverage data from multiple data sources. And to Jolie's point as well, I do think that this involves bringing diverse patient voices to the table as well. I think sometimes we tend to think about engaging patients like once the trial's already been designed, and now we want to go ahead and engage the community at that point to quote unquote convince or educate. I think that there's also a lot of education that we can get as well. That's one of the reasons within my company, we have a health equity scientific advisory board with representation from patients as well, who help to provide voice and perspective on how we're developing our tools as well. So bringing that to the fore is also important. And then I think one more thing related to that is, I think we also need to explicitly define instances where oversampling patients from historically underrepresented patient populations is warranted, both from a methodological perspective, but also from an equity standpoint, in order to ensure that we're actually able to detect what these meaningful differences, if any differences in safety and efficacy actually exist. We need to make sure that we're adequately powered, these studies are adequately powered so that we can actually detect these differences. So those are my thoughts.
Henry?
Yeah, thank you. So for me, I think what is the really most important thing is that we don't shoot for perfection, that we have to get absolutely the precision here, because it really is an inexact science, as we have all of these data sources. As I said, we have to triangulate that into one common goal. But I think really it's time for action. So making sure that we set these goals or range of targets for what we want to achieve for these diverse populations, and then we really get down to the business of doing it and implementing these targets, and then all of the operational tactics that we can think of to make this come to life. And I think that's really, it's a time for action. And I kind of appreciate the fact that we need to have these diversity equity plans as part of the process with the FDA now, because it's really calling upon the industry to start to make a meaningful difference. Thank you.
Building on what Henry has said, and when we are successful with this execution, let's show and tell. Like, I like what Cleo said, there's so much competition, but this is an opportunity for us to share best practice. No one's going to lose if we do that.
And Lola, final words from you.
It sounds like I coached all these folks, because I agree with everything they've said for the most part. And I would echo really and emphasize the issues around sharing what we learn, the failures and the successes, and the importance of broad stakeholder collaboration, transparency, and continued engagement with the regulators. I think, we're all learning on this journey here. And I agree with the comments about not really shooting for perfection, but really also moving from status quo. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel, a lot of food for thought for our audience. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Jeff for the next session.
Great. Thank you, Ria. And thanks to all the panelists for sharing your insights toward establishing enrollment targets. I want to thank the over 20 organizations that provided feedback regarding their efforts to date for establishing enrollment goals. Clearly, a great deal of data is needed to optimize accrual goals and design effective diversity action plans. While the challenges associated with data development and availability continue to be worked out, hopefully we can all agree that the goal is to simply do better and ensure that the clinical trials are more accessible and ultimately more representative of the people who use these new medicines. Diversity action plans are most frequently formalized in the context of pivotal clinical trials, but as you heard, the development of data regarding diverse populations is important throughout the life cycle of a drug. And this includes conducting more comprehensive research and evidence generation in the post-market space. Friends has had the privilege of being involved in multiple real-world evidence collaborations, looking at improving data quality and the generation of evidence from clinical practice. One potential application of real-world evidence is to provide insights from population subsets that were not part of the initial clinical trials used for approval. In addition to real-world evidence, post-market commitments provide an opportunity for different study types to help develop more comprehensive evidence. As a follow-up to the work discussed today, we're working in providing additional race and ethnicity data to improve this information throughout the life cycle of a drug. So stay tuned for additional details and forthcoming publications. Now, I'd like to be joined by a group of experts to provide their insights toward barriers that need to be addressed in order to operationalize more inclusive clinical trials. I'll turn things over to our moderator, President of the Fight Colorectal Cancer, Angie Davis. Angie, over to you.
Thank you so much. I was so excited to moderate this panel because the prior panel really set us up beautifully as to what we can do, but how do we actually do it? So our panel is joined by extremely accomplished individuals, Dr. Ed Kim, physician and chief at City of Hope, Orange County, Lucy Ganzauer. She is a DEI champion at SWOG Cancer Research Network. Christy Mitchell, co-founder and principal at Atlas Clarity and Health Equity Outcomes. And Dr. Nicole Ritchie, global head of health equity and population sciences at Genentech. And so we're going to really focus on a robust discussion around how do we not only identify our goals as it relates to equity and inclusion, but how do we operationalize it? How do we actually make this happen in communities? So I'm really excited to kick off this discussion with Christy, really posing the question of how do we build collaboration and trust in communities when we're introducing clinical trials and engaging the community in the recruitment process, in the study, and really kind of sustaining these relationships? Sorry, long question.
Thank you so much, Angie. I really appreciate this opportunity to share some of our thoughts, some of my personal thoughts as it relates to this particular question. I'm sure that many of the panelists have really a number of different solutions that they've put in place, but I'd like to really hone in on a couple. The role and value of trusted messengers within a community cannot go understated. These jewels within communities were one of the most impactful vehicles used to raise awareness and educate underserved populations during COVID. I mean, most notably, it was a great method for tackling vaccine hesitancy. Over the past several years, we have observed great strides in engaging faith-based leaders in particular in addressing clinical trial diversity. As you may be aware, faith-based organizations have significant reach within my own community, the African American community, with faith leaders commanding significant trust within this population. Moreover, given their roles leading congregations, they have a great deal of comfort, right, in speaking persuasively with their audience. And it's been our experience that this is a phenomenal combination. And as such, there's real opportunity to learn from this strategy at both a local and a national level. And so let me just give you a real quick example. We did a pilot in partnership. It was the Network for Excellence in Healthcare Innovation, NEHI, and Lilly. We supported a trusted messenger project through the Wellness Connection in Indianapolis, which was a nonprofit that promotes a more healthy, empowered community, really targeting spirituality. And using a typical train-the-trainer model, we trained several faith-based leaders to host workshops and town halls with their congregations to raise awareness and increase knowledge around clinical trials. And, for example, they engaged with over 135 church members across multiple different platforms, podcasts, webinars, you name it. And what we found after sort of rolling out this program was that not only did their knowledge about clinical trials change, but their attitudes toward participating in trials change. And we think that that's like a step in that process. Another example would be deploying community health workers. Again, they were found to be another jewel that emerged through COVID. But can we not begin to deploy community health workers to raise awareness about clinical trials and or serve in the role of clinical trial navigators? Providing implicit bias and cultural sensitivity training. We've heard this time in memorial, but that really goes really far in generating trust within the community because it's establishing a different type of relationship with providers. And then finally, one thing that we have observed, and it's really a nod to what we heard in panel 1, is about routinely capturing SDOH data. It sounds easy, but it's not, right? Both from a data collection perspective and what do we do after when we find out that there may be social needs, but it does establish a more solid, robust relationship between patients and providers. In essence, it's another way of generating and building trust, particularly in the context of recruiting for trials in the future. So I'll stop there, but there's just a number of different opportunities at both a patient, a provider, and a community level in which we can begin to engender and build and nurture trusting relationships.
Thank you, Christy. You did a great job of breaking that down and sort of where those intersections are in building trust. And so I wanted to turn to Lucy. I know you're in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And maybe you could share with us sort of where the rubber meets the road. How have you been able to be successful in building trust in harder to reach communities where trust may not be there?
Well, my background is working with community cancer centers with the NCORE. And part of our grant requirement encourages community engagement and looking at our catchment area. I think one of the most positive or successful has been really looking at your tumor registry, what is the demographics and your catchment area, and monitoring your clinical trial accrual against that. And where you see a shortfall, do specific engagements with those populations. And particularly in working with the NCORE of the Upstate and Southwest Oncology NCORE as well, both of those strategies improved our engagement of those populations and accruals. We were falling short, just like NCI was, in looking at adolescents and young adults and focusing on that community. We were able to increase our target to match our catchment area. And community engagement isn't a dramatic thing. It is developing small relationships, building on those where you're meeting the needs of both the program and the population you're serving. And it's an ongoing relationship that you continue year after year. And as one of the previous panelists talked about, is engaging with those specific leaders in those communities. I have found that extremely effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, you couldn't compare South Carolina to Orange County, probably different demographics and different challenges, but I think there is a thread there of leadership and championing clinical trials. And so I want to ask Ed, in your role at City of Hope, how have you seen your leadership in building physician relationships and collaborations help address some of these barriers to achieving our target goals for clinical trials and reaching communities?
Yeah, thank you, Angie. And again, it's a real honor to share the stage with all these amazing folks here who are championing our similar efforts. Ironically, Angie, my previous job was in North Carolina and South Carolina, where we built a 26 site network across both states and engaged clinical trials in those rural areas of North and South Carolina. And yes, moving to Orange County to basically put the same type of model in place, where one of the most diverse counties in the country, where we have an AAPI population of almost 30%, a Latino population of 30 to 35%. It's actually a little lower on the African-American side, about 9%. But the diversity of groups that exist within Orange County, the 6th largest county in the country, with over almost 3.5 million people, is pretty daunting. One of the things I think that a lot of people have stated or alluded to is you have to show up. You have to show up in your community. And what's really important is the faculty and the staff that you hire, that you bring on, are representative of these communities. I can show you a picture of my faculty, the 36 I've recruited so far in the last 2 years, and it is a very diverse group that fits the demographics of our surrounding areas. And so I think that all builds trust in not only having these experts in cancer who can, say we are doing the cutting edge therapies, but also showing up to the local community events. I can count thousands of events that we have a year. And all of our folks, whether it's our nurses, our APPs, our pharmacists, our executives, administrative leaders, and our providers, we show up and we want to participate in their events in a meaningful way so that we can show we're part of this community, that we have an investment in this community. This is all little things that build into trust. The other aspect is that we have to build trust by the care that we deliver. And so we got to back that up. If we're going to be out there showing up, we have to make sure that we deliver on our side. And as you know, we struggle on the provider side with just an awareness of studies and what's important, and B is making a enrollment to treatment transition that can be a little less clunky. And I think we have a lot of work there because, man, you engage somebody who wants to participate in a clinical trial. You've built their trust, and now they get into the system, and it takes longer than expected to treat someone with cancer. That cannot happen. So we have to create a lot of easy buttons for folks in order to really participate meaningfully in these clinical trials.
Those are really great points. And I think it lends itself to asking, what can the sponsor do to make it easier? And so, Nicole, as you hear, boots on the ground, community members saying, let's make it easier. Let's make treatment more efficient after you enroll someone to a clinical trial. What has your experience been, and what have you seen work as a sponsor?
So thank you. And it's wonderful to be a part of the panel. I want to start and build actually with something that Christy led in with around trusted brokers and community engagement. So one of the things that we found to be really important is partnership with established physicians and trial investigators who have long-standing experience with historically underrepresented patient populations in their communities. And Dr. Kim, we work very closely with in our both sponsorship and our expert panels that we bring together to convene KOLs such as himself, but also patient advocates. We've also put together this cohort of centers of excellence. We call it our Inclusive Research Site Alliance. And right now it's a group of 6 oncology centers and 3 ophthalmology centers that were built really as a proof of concept to show that this high touch model in partnering with these renowned oncologists or retinal specialists in the right places that have historic demonstrated ability to reach broader patient subsets will increase our ability to both accrue those patient subsets in our clinical trials, and it will do it expeditiously. So one of the things I think we battle against is this myth that trying to have more representative patient populations will slow down enrollment. We hear this all the time. And from a sponsor perspective, this is a battle with internal teams. But what we've actually shown with our Inclusive Research Site Alliance is not only do these sites accrue 60 to 80% more representative patients than their study peers, they also do it 3 times faster. So not only can it be done if you go to the right places and you partner with the right physicians who have that outreach into the communities that includes patient advocacy, that includes broad health equity efforts, it also shows we can do it in a way that could speed up enrollment, which does nothing but better our ability to bring medicines to patients faster. So I really think that community partnership and the partnership with the right physicians is such an important and critical element of what we invest in as sponsors.
That's such a great point. And I think it lends itself to us addressing how do we do that? How do we find the right physicians? How do we identify those champions? And Christy, so I wanted to ask you, as we look at barriers in participation, building trust, working together collaboratively, what has been your experience? Have has been the major barriers, but then also those major successes in overcoming those barriers?
Yeah, this really makes me think more holistically about what do we really mean by community engagement, right? So like if we're serious about embracing the essence of community engagement, that means that for me, meaningful partnerships to foster trust, right? Co-creating strategies and solutions, and then promoting change for collective impact, right? All of those pieces need to be put in place to cultivate a relationship with diverse communities such that we will see the changes that we're hoping to see. And so, this is not a short-term solution. It's going to require an investment and sustained engagement truly to make a difference. And so, here's an example of something that we've been working on. And again, in partnership with the Network for Excellence in Healthcare Innovation, this notion of piloting a community-focused research organization. This is something that I'm hoping will take root and grow. Because one thing that we're talking about is that we're going to the same communities over and over again. Can you imagine being in, a community in San Francisco and you get the number of sponsors reaching out asking you for the same thing? It becomes a little bit tiresome and you don't know what to do. You don't know how to prioritize. And so we were trying to come up with how can we make this a more efficient process on the community side so that they themselves can be a strategic partner. And so this idea of bringing 15, 20 different stakeholder organizations, which would be inclusive of like academic institutions, health systems, community-based and faith-based groups, fraternities, sororities, you name it, participating on a board, they may actually offer a diverse perspective as to how not only to sort of support clinical trial diversity, but really to close the gaps in health and healthcare disparities in their particular local community, which incidentally, folks who live in the community, that's their number one priority. It is not to be a part of your trial. It is to actually get the healthcare that they actually are looking for. And so wouldn't it be amazing if we can create a structure such that the community can help, elevate, raise awareness around opportunities for trials, but at the same time be in a position to really represent themselves, the underserved and underrepresented populations in this conversation. And so I like to throw that out there just because I'm really looking on behalf of communities, how can we do this in a more efficient way for us? And so I'm curious as to what some of my panelists think about that particular strategy.
Lucy, what has your experience been? Because that's really about patient empowerment, right? Like empowering your community to engage in the process and expanding that catchment to more champions. Lucy, what has your experience been?
Well, one of the things I think that's important to realize is it's not one strategy that works. It is a comprehensive plan with multiple approaches. At SWOG, we utilize a multiple approach in Pragmatica. And as the previous panelists talked about, our accruals have been so accelerated, we're all astounded. But we put in an 18-point plan on how to accrue to this program that included underrepresented populations. But that drove overall accrual. And then we did a small strategy focusing on the Southeast community sites because of the historically underrepresented African-American community. And currently, we're at 14.4% African-Americans in this trial. And according to the Pew organization, African-Americans above 65 are only 12%. So we're exceeding that population. When you do have intentionality and you focus on both the investigators, the research staff, the communities, community engagement, patient advocacy, and you put all of those things that we really know work and have intentionality about it. All of the strategies that we're using in our plan are evidence-based strategies that have been published, but we've got intentionality around it. And then we're monitoring that data every month and looking at it. I'm reporting every month on what I'm doing. Our community engagement leader is reporting every month on what he's doing, but it's a multifaceted plan. And when you put those evidence-based strategies in, they work. But as the previous panelist said, they work so well that we're exceeding our accrual, and that's a win-win. And Pragmatica is a public-private partnership, and so everybody benefits by this. Thank you.
Lucy, can I ask a follow-up question? How long did it take to get that system working?
For Pragmatica?
Like, how long did it take to get those systems internally working?
We just really put a concerted effort. So really Pragmatica came very quickly. We had to modify our plan because it was actually sent back by FDA. We did that modification in April and had our kickoff in May. And we opened the trial and immediately started working on those plans. At our annual meeting, we rolled out community engagement training for all of our sites. So we talked about the focus on that. I started meeting and traveling to NCORE sites in the Southeast. And our marketing department made patient-friendly presentations to advocacy group. Our community advocates were working with their advocacy groups. We had others who were reaching out to VA sites. So we're still implementing every aspect of our plan as we're going. I think we are still below where we want to be among the Puerto Rican and Asian populations, even though SWOG has got sites in Puerto Rico. So we're going to be focusing on Hispanic populations and our Puerto Rican sites to see if we can improve in those areas. But it does work. Intentionality works. When you use evidence-based strategies, it works.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Ed, I'm curious at City of Hope, how are you implementing programs like this? And does it help with site selection and real-time reporting? How are you helping build that infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a timely question, Angie. City of Hope has been around in Duarte, California for over 100 years. And it's obviously an NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center of Excellence Destination Center. Over the last 5 years, it's really changed and evolved and transformed into something very different. We now have over 35 regional sites in Southern California. We embarked on our second campus in Irvine, which we opened a year ago in August, and we'll open the inpatient hospital, which is sitting right behind me here, next year in 2025. In addition to that, we've grown our national expansion with now hospital sites in North Chicago, South Atlanta, and Phoenix. And so we are a national cancer network right now. So earlier I spoke to the Orange County and Duarte populations. One can now imagine if we can pull this off, where we can create a national singular network of a cancer institute that focuses on clinical trials from anything from therapeutics, CAR-T, BMT, to prevention and screening. And those communities, when we talk about Orange County, we talked about the diverse communities. In Duarte, we have a very large mixed population of cultures. Now we go to North Chicago, South Atlanta, not North Atlanta, because that's where all the hospital systems are. We're in South Atlanta. That's a very different population south of the airport in Atlanta. And we are really excited about engaging that community. And then in Phoenix, with the Native American population that exists there. That's one of the challenges. And Lucy's talked about their strategies. We're going to be showing up and placing trials in all of those areas. The second aspect is engaging our providers. We're creating this network as a cohesive network. There's going to be a lot of communication internally, and it's a priority for us to make sure that all of our patients, every one of our patients who come through our door, is offered a clinical trial. Now, if you have over 800 clinical trials, that's very hard to manage as any singular provider. So I've actually developed a software cloud-based platform that is called Hope Pathways. We will be implementing this all across the country. It will allow our providers, whether you're a nurse, APP, PharmD, or an MD, you can open up and see exactly what trial is available for that particular patient on a daily basis. It'll say whether it's open or closed, and you'll be able to click twice to reach a study coordinator via email to send them information and screen. And you can screen from any state in the country or any country on this world. So it will connect our universe. So we're very excited about that. The next aspect I think is important is, and Lucy touched on this, and one thing I want to bring up is the Pragmatica study. Studies in general in oncology are overly complicated. Just knowing the drugs and the structure and the mechanism of action, those are hard enough for, someone like me to even understand. But now you tack on between 30 and 40 eligibility criteria, and I will continue to make this point until this is not a problem anymore. That's too many. We are overcomplicating our studies. It is very important to keep patients safe. It's important to make sure we monitor safety and side effects, but we don't need that many eligibility criteria. The more eligibility criteria you tack on onto a study, the less number of people can be included in that study, and that inherently is discrimination. And so we need to really think about ourselves, whether it's investigators writing the studies, whether it's the pharma writing the studies. Let's get down under 20. Let's go an easy goal here. And we've been pushing this initiative, and NCI, FDA has been very supportive of this. And, Friends of Cancer Research has had a big part in helping lead this with the American Society of Clinical Oncology. But we need to reduce eligibility. I dream of a day where there's less than 10 eligibility criteria. Man, the patients would get enrolled. They wouldn't have to go through all that. The study staff would be so happy not to have to, go through a 40-point checklist on every patient just to see if they're eligible. And how sad is it that, and I've seen too many of these examples, you have a drug that targets a specific driver mutation. That mutation has a 3% incidence in a underserved population. You find that mutation in the patient. The drug is not FDA approved yet, but eligibility criteria 36, you're not eligible. That is the saddest part I ever see in these clinical trials. So we have to be able to be more broad in our eligibility. We want to be inclusive of our populations. And one of my new tasks at City of Hope, they must think I'm not busy enough, so now I've assumed more responsibilities, is to build this national network, is to be cohesive with our investigators across our 4 states and our 40 sites in Southern California. And we're going to do that. I've outlined a 6-month plan where we will do that. And so I hope we can serve as a model for other systems in how we are going to create diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials operations.
I think that is the power of having a champion in your system. I mean, just being able to see what you've been able to accomplish and tackle. In closing, though, I want to give Nicole the first sort of word of advice, but I'm going to have each panelist provide advice, guidance, a tip on how can we tailor our clinical trials in a way that is more inclusive. So what can we do from your perspective to reduce barriers to clinical trials? I heard reducing the inclusion-exclusion criteria, but what are some other things that we can do? And I'm going to start with you, Nicole.
Certainly, I think there's many operational aspects that have been spoken to around financial burden and just logistics, being supportive of patients. It's very rational, pragmatic things. My favorite thing about being on panels with Ed is the inclusion-exclusion criteria conversation. And I think I've heard him get it down to like just one. They have the type of disease under study. But I will build on that to say that there are numerous data analyses, and Cleo spoke to this in the last panel, that have shown that inclusion-exclusion criteria, we can still show efficacy by reducing inclusion-exclusion criteria and doing it in a very systematic and data-driven way. So I just want to jump on that bandwagon and reiterate the point again from the protocol perspective, the overall burden perspective, and then just going to the right locations. So building those partnerships, going to the right locations, thinking about the patients and their totality of health and supporting them throughout the clinical research endeavor.
Lucy.
One additional thing I'd like to mention is patient stipends. patients have real-world financial barriers for clinical trials, additional visits, which is additional transportation costs. And I have found that patient stipends really reduces that barrier. And more importantly, I think it puts us on a trust relationship that it's not all about what you're giving us to do this clinical trial, but a partnership with the patient. So I really strongly advocate looking for patient stipends to assist with additional costs that the clinical trial puts a burden on the patient. Thank you.
Thank you. Christy?
So much of what I would have said has been said, but I have to give Dr. Kim a shout out. I am so excited by this Hope Pathways. I just like to pick that up and adopt that and bring it to some of the other locations that you guys have not reached out to. So that's, and put that on the side. But in addition to what both Nicole and Lucy spoke about, I think it's important to continue to be committed in getting the voice of the patient who is participating in clinical trials, have them provide testimonies and serve as almost like ambassadors back to the community for which they come from. Because I think that that is a tremendous sort of voice to encourage others to consider participating in trials if offered, which is also a big question. Are you offered? So thank you.
Dr. Kim?
You know, I think it's wonderful to have this army of advocates on this call, and we need to continue to recruit and build our army. I love what Christy said about the patients. We opened a pancreatic cancer screening study in Orange County, and one of our first 10 patients, we found someone who had multiple scans that were negative, continued to have abdominal pain, and lo and behold, we found a 2-centimeter pancreatic cancer that was resected, and she's cured. And we only opened that study because of philanthropic organizations that we got to fund it. That was not going to be funded by industry, is not going to be funded by anything else. And so I got to address that group the other night when they came through, and I told them, you cured this woman of her pancreatic cancer. She never would have had the opportunity to find it if not for you all. So it is our patients who have to be our advocates. It's our sponsors who have to be our advocates, and just continue to grow the team. And Friends of Cancer Research has been really great in being out in front on this. And so I think I salute all of you for all the work that you're doing and appreciate the advocacy.
That was really well said. And Friends has done an excellent job of pulling these discussions together and really making sure that the patient voice is at the table. I think that all the panelists have touched on this, but this is a layered issue. It needs to be addressed holistically. We need to have trust. We need to have champions. We need to have all our target audiences and target populations represented. And you all have done such tremendous work in helping us better understand this. So I'll turn it over to Jeff for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Angie, and thanks to the entire panel for this really timely and important conversation. I want to thank all the panelists and speakers for joining us today. Today's discussion has identified and emphasized tangible steps that we all can take toward enhancing diversity in clinical trials.